It's now official. Red Bull was the only team to break Formula One's first cost cap with its 2021 accounts. But what does that mean and what happens next? To help me, Glenn Freeman, get into that, we have Ed Straw and Ben Anderson here with us. And Ed, let's crack straight on. What do we now know officially? There's been so many rumours about this. We have some official detail, but not all of the detail. So what do we know and what have we heard from Red Bull in reaction to this news?
Well, it's the key day in the cost cap. It's the day when the FIA issues the certificates of compliance. 7 teams have got that, meaning they were 100% compliant with all the demands of the cost cap. That means 3 teams didn't. And we should note the FIA has said that 9 teams were below the cost cap, which means the one that wasn't was Red Bull, which has been found guilty of a minor breach of the cost cap regulations. That means a breach of less than 5% of the total. Now, that's quite significant, or could be quite significant. We don't know how much they breached it by, but in 2021, the baseline figure for the cost cap was $145 million. So a minor breach could be north of $7 million still. We're waiting to find out how much it is. So what happens next? Well, the FIA Cost Cap Administration is currently evaluating what action to take against Red Bull and Aston Martin for that matter, but Red Bull is the really significant one. So we don't yet know what the penalty is, if any. That's not yet been decided. Red Bull, of course, has responded. They've said they're surprised and disappointed at this because their submission was under the cost cap. So that tells us a few key things. It tells us this was not an accepted breach agreement, which teams can reach with the cost cap administration. They mean that the team accepts there's a breach and there's an agreed penalty. So that's if you cooperate and say, yes, this is a problem. It also means we know that Red Bull is going to challenge this. So it'll be all about the fine detail of the submission. I don't think this is going to be something to do with there being suspicions of some secret base somewhere that's not being declared, but about the way that Red Bull has declared things, classified things, the way they've structured their submission. So that's where this case is really going to focus on, the granular detail of how they've classified things. It's not a very box office thing in terms of the details, but in terms of the potential implications and of course the future of the cost cap, it's absolutely huge.
Ben, obviously one of the key things we don't yet know, as Ed mentioned there, is how much Red Bull overspent by. But we know the range. Ed outlined the kind of minimum and maximum that it could be. Is there any way to quantify any kind of advantage, how much that could have been worth to Red Bull if they were overspending, or they were overspending in 2021?
Well, helpfully, Ferrari's Mattia Binotto was asked about this on Sunday at the Japanese Grand Prix. Now, it should be said, of course, Ferrari's been one of the key critics of Red Bull over this matter, so it's in Ferrari's interest to maybe overstate the implications of the overspend. But he said that, well, a spend of $5 million would equate to roughly half a second, and an overspend of $1 to $2 million would equate to between 1/10 and 2/10 of a second. So that gives you some idea of the advantage that Red Bull could gain from their overspend if those figures are accurate. Lewis Hamilton was talking in the Thursday press conference at Suzuka about how even a small £300,000 difference could have been decisive in his title fight with Max Verstappen. But if you use Binotto's figures as a baseline and then divide for what Lewis said, that equates to something like 0.02 of a second. So I couldn't really see a race last year where that kind of difference proved really decisive. Maybe the pole position battle with Verstappen at Zandvoort, but in the second half of the season, which is what Lewis was referring to, generally the gaps were much bigger than that. So for Red Bull's overspend to have had any real impact on the title fight based on what Binotto was saying, you're going to have to see figures in the kind of $2 million plus range, I think. And the indications so far have been it's not that egregious, but obviously this is the key detail we just don't know yet.
And let's hope we are going to get full disclosure from the FIA when the details come out. But Ed, until this announcement came out, all we were dealing with really was speculation. And Red Bull fiercely argued against that speculation. Christian Horner was at the forefront of this. You've mentioned that Red Bull have put out a statement effectively maintaining that position, even though the news and the breach is now official. So if we've got the FIA saying they've definitely breached it, they've definitely overspent, and Red Bull are still arguing their case, are Red Bull being dishonest?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? But fundamentally, nothing Christian Horner has said is provably misleading, is it? Because it's true. When he was saying that, it was speculation. That speculation's proved to be true, but it still wasn't official at that time. They've said again that their submission was below the cost cap. That's what Horner said in the past, and I'm sure that the bottom line figure, when you get to the end of it, is below that number. The FIA doesn't think that's the case. So this is all going to come out in the wash ultimately, because they'll have to go through it. It's going to be a lot of back and forth between Red Bull and the FIA cost cap administration about how they've done this. And I think whether or not people are being misleading or whatever, it's all about the way you classify your spending, all about the way you use exclusions. And these cost cap regulations, if anyone has a look online at them, there's a lot of exclusions, and there's a lot of things where the value of things are set according to who's doing what. We have to remember the Red Bull team structure is quite complicated. You've got Red Bull Racing as one entity. You've got Red Bull Technology. So there's services exchanged between the two, etc. So there's lots and lots of places to look at in terms of understanding this. And it'll come down to, can Red Bull, by the wording of the regulations, defend their submission against what the FIA cost cap administration thinks has been done incorrectly?
Yeah, a good bit of your spreadsheet versus my spreadsheet then. Let's move on to, assuming the breach is confirmed and Red Bull can't contest it, we have to get to the point of a punishment. Now, fortunately, this is outlined in the rules. We know what the options are that are available to the FIA. I've got them to hand here. We'll put them on screen for you as well. So let's quickly run through them. The possible punishments here include a public reprimand, which would be utterly pointless, deduction of Constructors' Championship points for the championship that took place within this period, so 2021. The same for the Drivers' Championship. Are we really going to see Max Verstappen lose his 2021 title? Suspension from one or more stages of a competition or competitions, excluding the race itself. So, I don't know, you have to sit out a practice session or a qualifying session maybe. Limitations on the ability to conduct aerodynamic or other testing, or a reduction of the cost cap in the future. So let's work through those and pick what we would do. Ben, I'll come to you first. Presented with that list, what punishment are you handing down for Red Bull if you were given the power?
Wow, this is a big responsibility. So to me, the first thing is, it unfortunately all depends on how much they've overspent by. We know the range. So if they've gone over by what I would describe as an egregious amount, so $1-2+ million, it's quite flagrant and significant in terms of its impact, then I think you probably have to look at the points deduction, the most extreme among that list of penalties, just because these regulations are new. And when Ross Brawn announced them, I think back in 2019, he was quite adamant that they would have teeth, and that if you were flouting the cost cap, you'd be losing your championship. And no regulation is worth having unless you can enforce it properly. And if you don't have significant punishments for breaches, then it just encourages people to take the mickey out of the rules. So that's how I feel about it if Red Bull spent quite a lot more than it should have done, regardless of how they've classified it. If we're talking about something, okay, it's over, but it's quite minor, it's £100,000 or $200,000 or whatever, something that you could account for as a technical mistake, then I think you're looking at the more minor end. So I would still be quite harsh, but I would go for the restrictions on aerodynamic testing or reduction of their cost cap for the following years, by however much you want to say is a firm enough punishment or discouragement. The reprimand, I agree, is a waste of time. I mean, you would do that because you would do that anyway, I think. But I think whatever punishment, it has to be one that reinforces the strength of these regulations, because they're crucial for the future of Formula One.
Yeah, I think that point about the regulations needing to have teeth is important. Obviously, it depends on the scale of the breach, but there is one thing they can do that would send out a very, very big signal, which would be a constructors' points deduction. Because you could take 200 points off Red Bull for 2021 in the Constructors' Championship, and they're still going to be second. But that does lay down a big marker, because it's going to tell you in future that could cost you a championship. But you could also introduce a suspended element of it. so that if there's future breaches, you get a really, really serious penalty. So there's things you can do. I do like the reduction in the aero testing. That'll have a tangible impact. They could even park them for certain sessions on race weekends. Wouldn't that be fun? You can't do FP1 for half the season or something would be problematic.
Ooh, harsh.
Don't think the promoters would particularly like that one. But I think the really important thing, as Ben touched on, is this is about the future of the cost cap. And I think it's essential that the penalties in themselves, they don't need to be backward looking and vengeful, as it were. They need to be all about laying down a marker and drawing a line in the sand. And connected to that, this is about the next 10, 20 years of Formula One, not just what happened last year. That's a bit of a red herring. And I think anybody who thinks that the destiny of last year's World Championship will change on this, I think will be disappointed or surprised or whatever, because I don't think that's the way they're going to go. And I don't necessarily think that should be a way they should consider going, depending on the exact nature of the breach, which we still don't know. So there's big stakes here, but I think most importantly, the stakes are for the future. That's critical.
For me, I think, as you've both said, the key is that whatever punishment is handed out here has to be a deterrent in the future. I'd quite like a combination of restrict their aero testing in the future and reduce their next cost cap. So if you do overspend, you're going to have to pay that back at some point, maybe pay a bit more. And any development gains you've made from overspending, those are going to hit you hard as well by your future development being limited. But as Ed was outlining there, the key here is that whatever the FIA does, if it is decided in the end that Red Bull definitely overspent on the cost cap, something severe has to be done to prevent other teams deciding that this is worth it in the future.